Надеюсь, у вас все хорошо. Давайте мы подождем пару минут для того, чтобы все коллеги присоединились. Пока, по традиции уже, да, давайте пройдемся по некоторым техническим моментам. В первую очередь, сегодня, да, у нас спикер Хейзел Исраэл, поэтому у нас сессия будет проходить на английском языке, но для вас доступен синхронный перевод на русский язык, поэтому большая просьба к вам, когда начнется основная содержательная часть, в нижней части вашего экрана в Zoom, да, пожалуйста, нажмите на кнопку перевода и выберите канал перевода с английского на русский, чтобы у вас была возможность полностью прослушать вебинар. Да, второй момент – это то, что наша сессия, как и все наши предыдущие, записывается для того, чтобы предоставить возможность всем нашим отсутствующим коллегам, да, ознакомиться с материалами сессии и также просмотреть запись. В связи с чем, да, большая просьба к тем из вас, кто не хочет, чтобы ваша картинка, да, чтобы ваше лицо попадало на запись данного вебинара, просьба выключить свою камеру и слушать вебинар без изображения. Следующий момент – это то, что у нас запись и материалы сессии будут доступны для просмотра и для записи на основных наших ресурсах, то есть это в телеграм-канале Дарья Скаффолд, да, и также на мини-сайте Дарья Скаффолд в Notion. Для этого да, мы хотели бы сейчас поделиться в чате ссылками. Да, если у вас не было возможности проверить данные ресурсы, пожалуйста, не стесняйтесь, сохраните их и воспользуйтесь позже. И последний момент, буквально, да, большая просьба во время основной содержательной части выключить ваши микрофоны для того, чтобы предоставить возможность всем прослушать вебинар без каких-либо помех. В конце сессии у вас будет отдельно выделенное время для того, чтобы задать вопросы и поделиться своими впечатлениями. Если у вас по ходу вебинара, да, будут возникать вопросы, пожалуйста, оставьте их в чате, да, и мы к ним вернемся в конце сессии. Давайте мы сейчас уже начнем. 3 минутки прошло. Время у нас ценный ресурс. Позвольте кратко напомнить вам про контекст, в рамках которого мы все с вами сегодня встречаемся. Напоминаю, мы с вами находимся во второй фазе Дарья Скаффолд. Дарья Скаффолд, в свою очередь, является частью большей инициативы Европейского Союза «Дарья». В свою очередь, Дарья расшифровывается как «Диалог и действия для находчивой молодежи в Центральной Азии». И данная инициатива, она полностью реализуется Европейским фондом образования в тесном сотрудничестве с 5 республиками в нашем регионе, в частности, с ответственными органами, которые отвечают за развитие качества образования и профессиональных навыков. В свою очередь, наша команда, да, Дарья Скаффолд, мы помогаем вам, педагогам, более эффективно планировать ваши занятия посредством инструмента Scaffold. Как раз-таки мы поэтому с вами в том числе сегодня проводим вебинар, да, который посвящен профессиональному развитию. Да, можно будет сразу следующий слайд. Хотелось бы перед началом вебинара буквально очень кратко напомнить вам, что у нас сегодня, да, 5-я сессия из серии вебинаров Дарья Скаффолд по профессиональному развитию педагогов. Сейчас вы на слайде видите полный перечень всех сессий, которые у нас уже прошли. Как вы видите, у нас еще осталась только одна сессия, которая будет посвящена обмену. Анонс на данную сессию также будет располагаться своевременно в нашей группе в Telegram, а также на мини-сайте Дарья Скаффолд. И теперь без особых отлагательств позвольте передать слово нашему сегодняшнему эксперту, да, эксперту Дарья Скаффолд, Хейзел Исраэл. И, уважаемые коллеги, напоминаю, да, еще раз, пожалуйста, переключите функцию да, перевода сейчас. Hazel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you for your great introduction. I would like to say Ramadan Mubarak to our colleagues who are celebrating this festival at this time of year at the moment. But so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining today's session. As the title slide says, the topic of today's webinar is measuring what matters. So you are beginning to use Scaffold, you're experimenting with new techniques, trying different methods, looking to deliver different competencies. So how do you know if what you're doing has an impact? How do you know that these changes to your practice are having the desired impact then with your learners? So we're focusing on evaluation and assessment in today's webinar, not as paperwork, not just to report learning, but as a way of understanding whether learning has actually changed, in what ways learning has changed, whether it has been successful and effective. So if we could move on to the first slide, please. Okay, so when we talk about impact, we're often pushed towards numbers, data, and outcomes. We tend, as education systems, to look to measure those aspects of learning which are easiest to measure. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether we assess and evaluate what is easy to assess and evaluate, or whether we're actually looking to capture those aspects of learning that we value, that we think are important. So when we're talking about competence-based learning, impact is about change at its simplest. The change in how learners think, changes in how they behave, changes in how confidently they can apply learning. And today's webinar is about learning how to notice and work with those changes when we use Scaffold. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So what do we mean by impact then? In scaffold-based learning, impact is evidence of change, not evidence of activity. So completing a task is not impact. Repeating information is not impact. Impact shows up when learners ask better questions, make choices independently, connect ideas across contexts, make those new connections, and apply learning in new situations. These are the changes that matter in competence-based learning and the ones that we want to evaluate. So if we go to the next slide. So there are three broad kinds of impact we look for when we're using Scaffold. So there's the learning impact, so that learners can understand or apply new knowledge. There's the engagement impact, where we more effectively engage learners, and we know this because learners are showing greater curiosity, motivation, or persistence, perseverance. But also competence impact. Are learners practicing new skills, new competences? Are they acting more independently? Are they being more creative or responsible? Competence impact is often the hardest to see, but it's also the most valuable. So let's go to the next slide. So why measuring everything doesn't work? So a common mistake is trying to measure too much. When teachers feel pressure, they often collect lots of data, but still feel unsure about what it tells them. Scaffold encourages a different mindset. We want to measure less, but measure what matters. Also, I think there's a problem, certainly in English. I'm not sure if this is the same in Russian, but the term measure, when we measure something, it suggests a ruler, units of measurement. It sort of almost forces us into a more numerical, quantitative scale, whereas often competences are more qualitative. So when we talk about measuring what matters, we're not collecting proof, we're noticing signals of learning. So how can we tell that that learning takes place? If we could go to the next slide, please. So what do signals of impact look like then? So signals might include evidence like learners using new language, learners explaining their reasoning, learners choosing strategies independently. So there's that greater independence. Learners reflecting more thoughtfully than before. And these signals, whilst they are small, together, they build a very clear picture of impact. If we could have the next slide, please. So in terms of simple, practical ways to gather evidence then, you don't need new systems or tools necessarily. Teachers can gather evidence through focused observation, having a keen set and clear sense of what you're looking for and looking to observe those behaviours, those changes in learning behaviour through observation, focused observation. Teachers can gather evidence through short learner reflections, comparing early and later work, ipsative assessment. So where are they before they undergo some learning? What's changed? How do they perform now? What do they know, can do, understand, explain, and so on? Now, following that learning, listening to learners' discussions, asking questions, collecting brief peer feedback. These are all tools that we would use on a daily basis, but it's the way that we plan to use those tools, the way we structure them, and being very clear about what it is we want to see. So the goal is insight, not perfection. This is information which tells us about how effectively or not our learners are progressing. We could go to the next slide, please. Great. So the evaluating phase of scaffold then. So the evaluating phase helps teachers reflect on what happened as a result of their planning and teaching. So as a teacher, you have selected a particular method. You've used that method with your learners. What happened? What was the impact? What were the results of that selected method? Each scaffold card suggests what success might look like in terms of those hints available to you on each of the method cards. So evaluation then asks, did that happen? So we have a rationale for selecting particular methods. We used them, and then what happened? Did we achieve our anticipated and desired results following using this method? So did that happen? For whom? Under what conditions? So this turns scaffold into both a planning tool and a learning tool for teachers. So if we go to the next slide. So evaluation only matters if it informs what happens next. So why do we reflect and evaluate? It's a critical part of continuing improvement. So we're always looking to, as teachers, we are always learning. I mean, certainly that's what I found to be the most interesting and satisfying part of my job as a teacher, was how I was always learning new things, learning about my learners and their needs and their preferences, their interests and aspirations, learning about my subject, learning about my craft, if you like, my practice. So I was always learning. So this evaluation phase is a critical part of thinking, right, okay, what worked well? I need to do more of that. What didn't work so well? What would I need to do differently? So it's a critical part of that continuous improvement and developing and improving our practice over time. So 3 simple questions can help us with this continuous improvement. What should we keep doing? What should we adjust or change? And what should we try next time? And this is how evaluation feeds directly back into the planning. Because I'm not sure if you've come across this in your practice, but it's interesting that you can have an activity that works really well with one group of learners. And you think, oh, that's a brilliant activity. I'm going to use that again. And then when you try it with another group of the same learners in terms of age, same age learners, same subject, same course, the activity is a complete flop. Why is that? So it's reflection and evaluation, which helps us to answer those questions. What should we keep doing? What should we adjust? And what should we try next time? If we could go on to the next slide, please, Victoria. So I've got some worked examples for you here. I've got an example from primary, I've got an example from secondary, and I've got an example from vocational education and training to try to bring these ideas to life for you, to show you what this looks like in different contexts, okay? So context to the primary level example, then we're looking at ages 7 to 11. So the learners I'm looking at specifically are around 9 or 10. So this was a short cross-curricular project focused on local community and place. The purpose wasn't simply to learn facts about the local area. It was to develop curiosity, communication, and initiative. All the key competencies that we care about at primary level. So when the teacher planned this learning using scaffold, they made some very deliberate and purposeful choices. In terms of teaching method, they chose inquiry and discussion. This already signals that learning will be dialogic, exploratory, and learner-led rather than instructional. The learning activity was exploring the local area. Now, this mattered, this was important because it gave learners something real and shared, a shared experience to talk about, to question, to ask questions about, and to interpret and build understanding together. So the competence focus was very specific, and the focus in this activity was asking questions and sharing ideas. One success prompt from the scaffold cards guided everything that followed. So it was learners ask relevant questions and build on each other's ideas. Importantly, this prompt didn't just guide planning, it became the focus for evaluation. Rather than trying to evaluate everything, the teacher decided to look for just 3 things. Who was asking questions? What kind of questions were they asking? And whether learners were responding to each other's ideas. So evidence was gathered very simply. Brief notes during discussions, short learner reflections, and comparisons with earlier conversations. So there were no forms, no scores, and no tick boxes, just noticing change. Okay. So if we could go on to the next slide. So then we're looking at the outcomes, next steps, and insight from this example. So when the teacher reviewed the evidence that they gathered, what they had noticed, several clear changes stood out. Firstly, more learners were contributing verbally. So participation widened beyond the same confident view. You always have those sort of learners who are very keen and quick to answer and to get involved. And you have those more reticent learners who lack confidence and are less willing to take a chance to answer first. So, but following this new approach, more learners were contributing verbally. So this was great. It included and engaged much more, a greater number of learners in the class. So that was great. The questions changed. Early questions were factual and closed questions. Things like names or locations, who did this, when was that, what is this, those sorts of questions. Later, questions became more exploratory, more open-ended, more interesting questions, I would say, activating those higher levels of skills, higher level thinking skills. So they started asking questions like why? Why were things the way they were? Or what might change in the future? How did something happen? So much how questions, why questions, much more interesting. Then learners also began responding to each other, not just to the teacher. So ideas were picked up, ideas were challenged and extended by peers. Students started asking questions of each other, not just of the teacher, so that they could learn from each other, challenge each other, probe each other, ask questions to go deeper in their thinking. So this wasn't just about engagement. This is very much about competence development. Because the teacher had focused on one meaningful success prompt, evaluation became genuinely useful. This was very focused, very specific. So in planning the next lesson, the teacher decided to keep inquiry-based discussion, introduce more pupil-led questioning, and step back further to allow greater independence for the learners. So the teacher was much happier and more confident to hand over responsibility for the learning to the learners themselves. In previous webinars, I've talked about a phrase we have in English where the teacher's role is the sage on the stage. It's the wise person who knows everything, who stands at the front of the classroom and delivers information and knowledge. So they are the they know everything and they're going to deliver that information and then hand that knowledge over to learners. So that's the sage on the stage. We like the phrase because it rhymes, so it's easier to remember. The sage on the stage, but also then what we're talking about in terms of scaffold, and this is one of the principles of scaffold. So it's moving away from delivery of content to facilitating learning. So you're sort of nurturing learning rather than filling up children and pupils full of knowledge. So we're moving from sage on the stage to guide on the side. So we're standing alongside our learners, prompting, asking questions, providing conditions within which learners develop their own learning, gain their own knowledge, skills, and understanding. And they're developing independence, they're gaining confidence and independence from working together and reducing that reliance on the teacher. So that's what we mean when we talk about the teacher stepping back and handing over responsibility to learners to allow them to develop greater independence. So the key insight here is that evaluation didn't end the learning. It wasn't terminal. It was used to shape what happens next. Because very often teachers will think about assessment and evaluation as something that happens at the end. And it's just about reporting. So we've done this learning, the students have a test or some sort of assessment task, and that shows us whether they've gained what we hoped they would. And that's the end of that. And what we're talking about here, as I've already mentioned, is much more a part of that continuous improvement, that continuous competence development, reflecting to identify how to improve, what next steps to take. So shaping what happens next. And by noticing change over time, the teacher could make informed decisions that continued to develop learner competence. So competence, when learners are learning knowledge, it's something that they learn, they've got it or they haven't. You can assess quite in a straightforward manner if they have that knowledge. Do they remember it? It's recall. It's quite low down in terms of thinking skills and the order of thinking skills. Competence development is something which is ongoing. These, and particularly when we talk about the key competence frameworks included in Scaffold, these are competences which will be developed throughout life. So from early primary all the way up through to higher education and beyond into lifelong learning and learning in work, continuous professional development. When we think about what we're doing now as educators, we are developing our competence. So this is something that continues over time. So next I'm going to move on to the next slide, please, Victoria, to the secondary worked example, the worked example from secondary school. Bear with me. Okay, so in terms of the secondary level example, and this example comes from a secondary classroom with the learners aged around 14 or 15 years. The focus here was on applying knowledge, not just memorizing content to recall or remember in a test. Learners were required to explain and justify their choices, something many secondary school teachers say that learners find difficult, that they find it challenging and they struggle with it. So using scaffold cards and methods, the teacher planned learning around problem-based learning as the teaching method. So this already shifts the emphasis from a series of correct answers or right answers. We're moving away from that. The emphasis of this particular learning is on reasoning and decision making, coming up with multiple ways of solving a problem. So the learning activity asks learners to select and justify a solution rather than follow a prescribed method. And we're thinking here that there is not one right answer. We want lots of different suggestions. And this is why these key competences are so critical at the moment in the world which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We need new and different ways of doing things to preserve resources when we think about sustainability, when we think about water, precious resources. We need to find new ways to do things. So our students and pupils need to be good problem solvers. They need to be creative and come up with many different ideas which could potentially solve shared problems. So the learning activity then, as I've said, asks learners to select and justify a solution. And the competence focus here then is critical thinking and reasoning. So the success prompt guiding evaluation was very clear. Learners justify decisions using evidence. So during the lesson, the teacher deliberately avoided asking, have they finished the task? Have they all got the same answer? Instead, evaluation focused on 3 questions. Were learners giving reasons for their choices? Were they able to explain why they had made the choices they had? Were they using subject knowledge to justify decisions? Had the quality of explanations improved over time? Evidence came from annotated learner work, listening to group discussions, and comparing early and later explanations with a particular focus on language use. So if we go on to the next slide. So the evaluation revealed several important changes. Learners moved from short, undeveloped answers to structured explanations. Okay, structured explanations. Okay, sorry, I don't know where I am with my presentation a minute. Could we move on to, let's have a look. No, there we are, we're on the second slide there, that's good, okay. So learners moved from short, undeveloped answers to more structured explanations. More learners began to use subject-specific vocabulary and language more accurately and appropriately. And in some groups, learners started challenging each other's reasoning in constructive ways. So this indicated both learning impact and competence impact. Crucially, evaluation also highlighted what wasn't working yet. So the teacher realised learners needed more support early on with justification skills, giving them reasons for having worked in particular ways. But also the teacher realised that the peer discussion was playing a significant role in improving the students' reasoning in terms of their thinking and their rationales. So as a result of this review and evaluation, the next lesson included explicit modelling of explanations and more structured peer critique activities. So many more well-organised, well-structured activities to prompt peer feedback and engagement, because they found that it was this practice in providing detailed justification and rationale that made the big difference. The key insight here is that evaluation directly improved teaching decisions. So based on those observations and the evidence collected through the activity, the teacher was able to identify what had worked and then to use more of those strategies in their planning for future sessions to build on and further develop and improve and grow what the learners were gaining, that impact. So by focusing on the quality of reasoning rather than just completing the task, the teacher could target instruction much more precisely. Okay, so we've got the next slide, please, is the vocational education and training example, further education example. So this comes from a vet setting with learners preparing for employment or professional practice. So the goal here was not just skill execution, just practicing and applying skills, but developing professional judgment and independence. So competencies that really matter in real workplaces. Planning with scaffold, the trainer selected real world problem solving as the teaching method and designed a workplace task scenario as the learning activity. So the competence focus was responsibility, taking responsibility and developing independence, but also decision making. So the success prompt guiding evaluation was learners make informed decisions and explain their reasoning. During delivery, the trainer focused on three things: how learners approached decisions, whether they could explain why they chose certain actions, and how confidently they worked without structure, without that step-by-step guidance. So evidence was gathered through observation, doing practical tasks, short reflective questions, and brief discussions about the choices made. Again, nothing particularly new here, no complex tasks or tools required. These are methods that we would use on a regular basis, but it's the way that we plan to use those methods and the clarity of what we're looking for, how clear we are about what success looks like. That's when this sort of evaluation can really boost how well and effectively we measure the impact of the changes that we're making to our practice. So these are quite simple and easy things that we can use to capture and evidence impact. So on the next slide then, the evaluation showed clear competence development. So learners relied less on instructions and became more independent, more confident, more self-directed. Decision-making became more confident and purposeful. Explanations shifted from because I was told to because this is safer or because this is more efficient. The understanding was developed. Students were better able to explain the gains. So these changes were all directly relevant to the workplace. This is what employers want to see as learners mature and gain this independence and responsibility, particularly in the workplace. In response, the trainer decided to reduce scaffolding gradually. So when we talk about scaffolding, that's the sort of structure that a teacher provides for an activity. Step-by-step instructions, templates, guiding templates, lots of different strategies that we use for scaffolding learning. So the teacher wanted to reduce the scaffolding gradually, introducing more open-ended scenarios and building in more reflection on professional judgment. So these were the changes that the teacher made in response to reflection and evaluation. With, again, you'll notice across those three examples, very specific goals, very specific, very clear ideas of what success would be, what the learning objectives were, but also how those teachers have fed that learning, that professional learning, into their planning and practice for next time, if you like, those next steps, feeding that learning forward into planning for next time. So reducing scaffolding gradually, introducing more open-ended scenarios, so that really sort of engages learners to make decisions, to justify the choices that they make, but also building in more reflection. So the key insight here is that evaluation helped align learning more closely with real practice. And by focusing on judgment rather than just task completion, finishing activities in class, learners developed competence that transfers beyond the classroom. So then our next slide then is the key takeaway. So to summarize then, impact is evidence of change, not just activity. Competence development takes time and careful noticing. And planning, planning in terms of what it is we're looking for, being very clear about what we expect, and using a range of simple tools which we are confident and familiar with to gather that evidence to inform the reflection. Simple evidence is often the most powerful. And evaluation is professional learning, not accountability. The types of assessment we're looking at here are very much about that continuous improvement. So I've also got for you a downloadable handout. Let me just get that up for you, which you can download and keep. Here we go, which sort of summarizes everything that we've talked about today, everything that we've covered today. So let's have a look now then. So yes, so the handout then is a nice, easy, quick guide for you. If you're thinking about measuring impact, this gives you the steps that we've sort of talked through and illustrated in this morning's webinar. So measuring what matters is designed to help you to apply evaluation in a simple, meaningful way when using scaffold. But it can also be used as a discussion or a reflection resource in your own CPD sessions. So first of all, then, what do we mean by impact? In competence-based learning, impact means evidence of change. It's not about how busy learners were, how many activities were completed, how much documentation was produced. Impact shows up when learners think differently, act more independently, apply learning with greater confidence, or make connections across contexts. When we talk about key competencies, they are transversal competencies. And the transversal competencies, the reason that we learn these competencies, the reason why these competencies are important is because we need to be able to select and apply these competencies to new purposes, new and different purposes in new and different contexts. So these are competencies that we need to practice in work, in our everyday domestic lives, but also in college and learning, in formal learning situations. That's what makes these competencies transversal. So these changes often take time. They're not always immediately visible, which is why looking for them, seeking them out, noticing them matters. It's about making learning visible so that we know what's happened because we have evidence of it. And this is where I talked briefly earlier about measurement and the word measure in assessment. And certainly in terms of competences, it can often be more about how we evidence competences rather than how we measure with units of measurement. So instead of giving learners scores, it's much more descriptive. And you'll find when learners come to report their competences, for example, in job applications, on CVs, or in interviews, there's a very particular structure. They have to give examples of where they've practiced competences. And that's sort of the most effective way of structuring, describing and sharing competences that we have. There's a structure called the STAR example. So it's where you would, to be able to evidence a competence, you would structure an answer or an example using the STAR structure. So S is for situation, T is for task, A is for actions, and R is for results. So when sharing a competence that we have and using this STAR method, you would first of all give a couple of sentences to describe the situation, the context. This is the job I was in. I was working in such and such a place, and these were the needs. Secondly, then the T, the task, what it is that I would need to do in that situation. What was my responsibility? What did I need to achieve? So where was I? Who was I? What was I doing? That's the situation. The task is what did I need to do? Whether I'd been told that or whether I'd identified that task myself. Then at the action part is very much about what I did and how I did it. So in that situation, having been presented with that task, these are the actions I took. And that's not just I did this, then I did this, then I did this. It's very qualitative in the sense that we need to describe in what ways we did the actions we took, with whom, where, what made the way that we responded to that task particularly efficient. And then the R is the results. So what happened as a result? What was the impact? And that's very much about that sort of cycle that we've been looking at here. So it's like, what did we do? What did we learn? What does that mean for what we do next? So in these competence STAR examples, then we can give a situation and a task, what we did, and the impact we achieved. What were the results directly resulting from the choices that we made, the way that we did particular tasks. So yes, so that's the way that we need to share competences in job interviews and in job applications. And it just signals to us that it's not so easy to say, well, in terms of digital competence, I'm excellent, or I have an A or a score or a 14 out of 20. It doesn't work like that. We need to be able to describe competences qualitatively. And working in this way, sharing justifications, challenging ourselves at working together with peers, these are all ways in which we can further develop competences. So then further on the handout, we have 3 types of impact to look for. So when evaluating the use of scaffold, it's helpful to think about impact in 3 overlapping areas, the areas that we mentioned earlier. So there's learning impact. So these are changes in what learners know or understand. So evidence of these changes in learning might be clearer explanations, more confident use of subject-specific vocabulary, more accurate application of knowledge, improved reasoning. So these are all the types of evidence of learning impact that we could gather from observation, asking questions, peer collaboration, and so on. Then there's engagement impact that we talked about, changes in how learners participate and persevere and persist. So the sorts of things that we might look for into evidence engagement impact might be increased curiosity, more interested, asking more questions, willingness to answer questions, to get involved in a whole group discussion, willingness to attempt challenges. I'll have a go, take risks in learning, but generally the engagement impact would look for more active involvement. more confidence potentially, more independence. Those are things that are important. So competence impact then, changes in how learners act independently or creatively. And we would be looking for things like making choices and justifying them, adapting ideas for new purposes, working responsibly with others. Competence impact is often the most valuable and the easiest to overlook unless you are actively looking for it. Thirdly, then, measuring less, noticing more. So effective evaluation does not require collecting large amounts of data and numbers and scores. Instead, choose one aspect of learning to focus on. When you think about the worked examples that I've shared with you previously, they were very focused in terms of what they wanted to develop. So choose one aspect of learning to focus on. Notice small signals of change. Things, the sorts of things that we looked at, asking more questions, taking more chances, being more curious, becoming more confident, more independent. So notice those small signals of change and also build a picture over time. You are not trying to prove impact. It's not about accountability. It's not about reporting. You're trying to understand learning, to improve your practice, to boost learning for your learners. So today as well, we've also talked about simple ways to gather evidence. You can gather useful evidence using everyday classroom practices. Things like focused observation, notice specific behaviours. Things like initiating discussions, initiating activity, collaborating, asking questions, challenging, providing alternative explanations. So it can be as simple as, when we look to reflect with learners, when we want to engage learners, we can ask very simple, very short questions. Things like, what did you find difficult today? What decision did you make? Why? What would you do differently next time? How? So those sort of more open-ended questions which require reasoning and good detailed explanations. We can use work samples, that ipsative assessment I mentioned, where we compare early and later work to notice progress or increased independence. In discussion and feedback, we can listen to how learners explain ideas or respond to peers. So we can listen and observe how the peers are working together. We can also look for small pieces of evidence collected intentionally with a clear focus. This is often enough. So then using the scaffold evaluating phase helps you to reflect on the outcomes of your planning and teaching. Each scaffold card suggests what success might look like. So evaluation asks, did this happen? For which learners? Under what conditions? And this helps to turn scaffold into a continuous learning cycle, not a one-off planning activity. That continuous improvement, continuous development we were talking about. Also, that continuous learning cycle then can help us to turn evaluation into better planning. So evaluation is only useful if it informs what happens next. So after reflecting, as teachers, we can consider these three questions. What should I keep doing? What should I adjust or improve or change? What could I try next time? So this is how evaluation feeds directly into planning and strengthens future learning experiences. So there's a short reflection activity on the handout, which I don't think we've got time for today. But there are 4 very simple questions we can ask ourselves. after an activity where we write brief notes for each of the following 4 questions. What change did I hope to see in learners? What evidence did I notice? What surprised me? What will I do differently next time? Even a few sentences against each of these questions can be enough to guide your next planning cycle. So a key message to remember then is measuring what matters is not about accountability and reporting. It's about noticing learning that matters, that is important. That's the learning that we're looking for, and using that understanding to design better learning experiences. Okay. So are there any questions or comments? Thank you very much for listening. I know that was a lot of information. I hope that I managed to keep it quite concise in a number of clear points, and that the examples that I've shared with you help to bring those points to life and to show you how these sort of these activities can play out in different contexts across primary, secondary, or vet. So thank you very much for listening. Are there any questions or comments on what we've talked about today? You're very welcome. It's lovely to see you. Thank you very much for spending your valuable time to come to be with us here today. Great. Remember to download the handout and put it somewhere convenient so that you have it as an at-glance prompt.
Уважаемые участники, спасибо большое за ваши комментарии, также за ваше присутствие. Отдельная благодарность нашему эксперту и нашей сегодняшней команде, да, по поддержке вебинара. Хотелось бы буквально в завершении напомнить, что материалы, запись сегодняшней встречи, а также раздаточный материал, который был подготовлен для вас, они будут доступны для просмотра и для скачивания на наших основных ресурсах. Это телеграм-группа Telegram, а также мини-сайт Дарья Скаффолд в Notion. А сейчас для вашего удобства мы еще раз продублируем ссылки на данные ресурсы. Пожалуйста, когда у вас будет время, воспользуйтесь ими и просмотрите еще раз материал. Надеемся, что у вас будет возможность также воспользоваться раздаточным материалом, потому что они как раз разрабатываются для того, чтобы вы смогли испробовать на практике всю информацию, да, которую вам готовят эксперты. На этом хотели бы завершить наш сегодняшний вебинар. Еще раз всем большое спасибо и желаем вам всем приятного вечера. Увидимся с вами в рамках оставшихся вебинаров Дарья Скаффолд. Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. See you soon.